11,000 years ago, the Great Lakes were surrounded by a world that no longer exists. Cold wetlands stretched between forests, shaped by retreating ice. Mammoths still moved across parts of North America. Saber-toothed cats hunted through the landscape. Giant ground sloths were still alive. And through the dark water of those wetlands moved something more than 8 feet long. It weighed over 200 pounds. It had front teeth reaching 6 inches in length, longer than a human hand, and it was a rodent. Castoroides ohioensis was the largest rodent ever to live in North America, an enormous relative of the beaver that survived on this continent for more than 2 million years. For much of that time, almost nothing seemed capable of removing it. It survived enormous changes in climate. It lived alongside some of the largest mammals of the Ice Age, and near the end of its existence, it shared North America's wetlands with another beaver, a much smaller one, the ancestor of the beavers still living here today. Both occupied the same changing continent for thousands of years. Only one survived, and the reason is stranger than simply being bigger or stronger. For nearly 180 years, scientists also misunderstood the giant beaver's enormous teeth. They looked like oversized versions of the cutting tools modern beavers use on trees. But Castoroides was not simply a modern beaver scaled up to the size of a black bear. Its teeth, its diet, and even the way it altered its environment tell a very different story. Humans may have known that story firsthand. The first people living in North America overlapped with the final giant beavers, meaning human beings may actually have watched these animals moving through the wetlands. And traditions preserved among indigenous peoples have long included stories of enormous beaver like creatures. Then, after more than 2 million years, Castoroides disappeared. Its smaller relative did not. The mammoths vanished. The saber-toothed cats vanished. The giant ground sloths vanished. And the enormous rodent that had survived alongside them went with them. But removing it from North America's wetlands may have changed more than the list of animals living there. Its disappearance helped leave behind a different ecological world. In tonight's journey, we're returning to the Ice Age wetlands of North America to uncover what this enormous rodent really was, what those 6-inch teeth were actually doing, and why the smaller beaver survived when the giant disappeared. But before we start, let me know in the comments if you have any topic suggestions you would like me to cover in future videos. Settle in and let's begin. Imagine a continent where water defined nearly every horizon, long before the familiar outlines of today's Great Lakes appeared. Broad sheets of meltwater spread across the land, collecting at the edge of towering glaciers and forming sprawling inland seas. This was the Pleistocene epoch, beginning about 2.6 million years ago and ending around 11,700 years ago. Many people picture this span as one endless freeze, though the living landscape offered far greater variety than that simple image suggests. Across much of what is now Canada, the Laurentide ice sheet rested over the continent, reaching nearly 2 miles in thickness across some regions. South of that frozen mass, another world unfolded. Grasslands stretched across open country, stands of boreal forest covered cooler ground, and immense wetlands filled the spaces between. Streams wandered through marshes, peat bogs expanded across low terrain, and shallow lakes reflected skies shaped by changing seasons. Fresh water gathered almost everywhere, weaving together habitats that supported an extraordinary abundance of life. The lakes themselves belong to an earlier chapter than those known today. Meltwater collected against the edge of the continental ice, creating enormous glacial lakes whose shorelines shifted whenever the frozen barrier advanced or retreated. Rivers constantly adjusted their paths, carving new channels while abandoning old ones. Shorelines appeared, disappeared, and formed again as enormous volumes of water searched for lower ground. Every movement reshaped the surrounding wetlands, renewing places where aquatic plants flourished in remarkable abundance. Such landscapes rewarded creatures adapted to life among reeds, ponds, and slow currents. Thick stands of underwater vegetation spread beneath the surface, nourished by mineral rich sediments carried from melting glaciers. Marsh grasses crowded the shallows, while floating plants drifted across sheltered pools. Fish, waterfowl, amphibians, and countless smaller animals thrived within these tangled habitats, creating one of the richest freshwater ecosystems North America has ever supported. Castoroides entered this environment as one participant in a remarkably stable ecological network. Generations passed within wetlands that remained dependable across immense stretches of time. Climate certainly changed, though those changes unfolded as repeating cycles. Extended glacial intervals gradually yielded to warmer interglacial periods before colder conditions returned once again. Each transition altered rivers, lakes, and vegetation, yet the continent repeatedly recovered broad expanses of marshland capable of supporting large semi aquatic herbivores. This repeating rhythm endured across millions of years. Populations shifted northward during warmer ages, then occupied southern refuges when ever advancing glaciers reclaimed northern territory. The pattern became part of the species' history, allowing it to persist through environmental swings that would seem astonishing on a human timescale. Adaptation unfolded alongside predictable cycles instead of abrupt transformation. Compared with modern North America, much of the interior contained considerably more standing water. Floodplains remained saturated for long periods. Seasonal flooding refreshed nutrient rich soils, and broad wetlands connected waterways into enormous living networks. Animals dependent upon shallow aquatic habitats found opportunities extending across landscapes that today have largely vanished beneath forests, farms, roads, and expanding towns. Within that watery continent, the giant beaver belonged completely. Every marsh, winding channel, and plant filled shoreline formed part of a setting that had been assembled over immense spans of geological time. The Pleistocene offered more than a backdrop for its existence. It shaped every generation from the beginning, surrounding this remarkable rodent with the flourishing wetlands that defined its world. Life has returned to the same solution again and again, even among animals that seem destined to remain small. A rodent may begin as a modest creature, darting through grass or slipping beneath tangled roots. Yet, under the right conditions, its descendants can follow an entirely different path. Across distant continents and separated by millions of years, evolution repeatedly expanded the familiar rodent form into animals whose size would have seemed almost unimaginable to their earliest ancestors. Today, rodents make up the most successful order of mammals on Earth, accounting for more than 2,500 living species and roughly 40% of all mammal species. Their usual design is wonderfully efficient. Small bodies require less food, mature quickly, reproduce often, and disappear into narrow shelters whenever danger approaches. For countless environments, this combination has proven remarkably successful. Nature, however, does not preserve a single design forever. Whenever predators become less effective and dependable food remains plentiful across many generations, different opportunities begin to appear. The advantages that once favored small bodies gradually weaken. Larger individuals can claim broader feeding grounds, travel farther in search of resources, defend valuable territory more effectively, and build greater energy reserves within their bodies. Those stored reserves become especially useful whenever seasons grow less favorable. Body size also changes the way an animal exchanges heat with the world around it. A larger animal loses warmth more gradually than a smaller one because proportionally less of its body is exposed to the surrounding air. This pattern, known as Bergmann's rule, helps explain why many animals living in cooler regions gradually evolved larger forms. Holding warmth more efficiently reduced the energy needed to maintain a stable internal temperature, allowing large herbivores to flourish where smaller relatives might struggle. These conditions have inspired giant rodents many times, each lineage discovering similar solutions without sharing the same recent ancestor. Around 8 million years ago, South America became home to Phobermus pattersoni, an enormous wetland rodent estimated to weigh as much as 200 pounds. Although that remarkable animal eventually disappeared, its distant relative, the modern capybara, still carries part of that evolutionary legacy. Even today, the capybara stands as the largest living rodent, offering a modest glimpse of how large this family can become. Far from South America, isolated islands produced comparable stories. The Canary Islands nurtured giant rats that descended from much smaller mainland ancestors after arriving across the sea. Within the Caribbean, another lineage expanded into Amblerrhiza inundata, a rodent approaching 200 pounds. Island environments often reduced pressure from large predators while providing dependable food, allowing body size to increase generation after generation until entirely new proportions emerged. North America during the Pleistocene offered many of the same ingredients without requiring an island at all. Extensive wetlands supported abundant aquatic vegetation, while comparatively few large hunters specialized in pursuing heavy semi aquatic herbivores. Within that setting, increasing size became an effective strategy instead of a burden. Over immense spans of time, natural selection favored individuals able to graze efficiently, retain body heat, and thrive within productive marshlands. Castoroides belong to this wider pattern instead of standing apart from it. Its remarkable proportions reflected a recurring tendency written into evolutionary history, one that surfaced wherever opportunity endured long enough for small beginnings to grow into something astonishingly large. A skeleton resting across the floor of a museum tells a story long before a single scientific paper is opened. Bone by bone, the outline of Castoroides emerges with surprising familiarity, then gradually drifts into something far outside everyday experience. Every feature recalls a living beaver for a moment, only to expand beyond expectation until the comparison no longer feels sufficient. Paleontologists recognize two species within this remarkable genus. Castoroides ohioensis occupied the northern portion of the continent and became the more widespread form, while Castoroides dilophytus lived across Florida and parts of the southeastern landscape. Together, they occupied an impressive range over immense spans of time, adapting to freshwater habitats that stretched across much of North America. The largest individuals rivaled the size of a black bear. An average adult measured about 6.2 feet from nose to tail, while exceptional specimens reached nearly 7.2 feet in length. Conservative weight estimates range from 170 to 220 pounds, although a few researchers have suggested that especially large animals may have approached 300 pounds. Standing beside such a creature would have challenged nearly every expectation of what a rodent should resemble. Its remains have appeared across an astonishing geographic range. Fossils are especially abundant around the Great Lakes region, including Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, yet discoveries extend from Alaska through the Yukon, eastward into New Brunswick, and south into Florida. Such distribution reveals an animal capable of thriving across many freshwater environments, provided suitable wetlands remained available. The skull immediately captures attention through its sheer solidity. Thick bone enclosed powerful jaws supported by broad muscle attachments. Every surface suggests tremendous chewing strength, with room for muscles capable of generating substantial force during feeding. Even without the famous incisors, the head alone gives the impression of unusual durability, shaped for processing vegetation that resisted ordinary bites. Behind the skull, the body appears lower and heavier than that of a living beaver. The legs were comparatively short, carrying much of the animal's weight close to the ground whenever it ventured onto land. Such proportions likely produced a deliberate waddling walk, while also lowering the body's center of gravity during movement through shallow water and soft marsh soils. The feet almost certainly carried broad webs between their toes, inherited from the family's long association with aquatic life. Swimming would have depended upon coordinated strokes from all four limbs, allowing the animal to move steadily through ponds and marshes. High-positioned eyes offered another useful adaptation, permitting much of the head to remain below the surface while keeping watch across open water for approaching danger. One feature continues to invite discussion among researchers. The tail has never been preserved well enough to settle every question. Current evidence suggests it differed noticeably from the broad paddle of the modern beaver. Many scientists favor a longer, narrower shape that tapered gradually, resembling the tail of a muskrat more than that of its famous modern cousin. Such a structure may have assisted with balance and swimming without serving as the broad steering surface familiar today. Its brain, measured against overall body size, appears proportionally smaller than that of the modern North American beaver. This difference hints at reduced behavioral flexibility and more limited problem solving, although bones alone cannot fully reveal the richness of an extinct animal's daily life. Fur color also remains beyond direct observation, though dark brown or chestnut shades seem the most reasonable possibility based upon its surviving relatives, completing the portrait of an animal both familiar and wonderfully unlike anything living today. Among every bone recovered from this remarkable animal, one feature always draws the eye first. Even when a skeleton is incomplete, the incisors remain unmistakable. Curving forward from the jaws like polished crescents, they seem almost oversized even after everything else about Castoroides has been taken into account. They are the kind of fossils that encourage immediate conclusions, inviting the mind to compare them with the familiar teeth of living beavers. Each front tooth could reach nearly 6 inches in length, placing them among the largest rodent incisors ever known. A modern North American beaver carries incisors closer to a single inch long, making the giant beaver's cutting teeth roughly 6 times larger. Scale alone creates an irresistible impression. Looking only at those proportions, it appears natural to imagine an animal capable of reducing entire groves of trees into scattered trunks with astonishing ease. Closer inspection reveals details that deepen the mystery. The outer enamel surface was not polished into a smooth curve. Instead, pronounced grooves extended from top to bottom, producing a ridged appearance, unlike ordinary cutting tools. Paleontologists describe these raised bands as girders because they resemble structural reinforcements built into bridges or buildings. Their arrangement strengthened the tooth against bending and fracture, allowing tremendous force to pass through the enamel without causing catastrophic failure. The lower jaw tells the same story. Deep within its surface lies a broad depression known as the masseteric fossa, the area where major chewing muscles attached. In Castoroides, This feature reached impressive proportions, leaving little doubt that powerful muscles once occupied the space. Every contraction would have driven the incisors together with exceptional strength, generating forces well beyond those needed for clipping delicate vegetation. The shape of the tooth tips adds another layer to the puzzle. Modern beavers possess narrow, chisel like edges that excel at slicing cleanly through wood fibers. Castoroides carried something different. Its incisors ended in broader, blunter surfaces that resemble scraping or gouging tools more than fine woodworking blades. Even without specialized training, many observers notice that these teeth seem built for heavy contact instead of precise cutting. Such anatomy strongly influenced scientific thinking after the first discoveries during the 19th century. Researchers recognized the animal as an enormous relative of the beaver family, then interpreted its anatomy through that familiar relationship. Beavers cut trees, harvest branches, construct dams, and build lodges. An animal carrying even larger teeth appeared destined for those same activities on an even grander scale. The conclusion seemed so reasonable that it endured for well over a century. Museum displays, illustrations, and popular books often portrayed giant beavers felling impressive trees across Ice Age wetlands. The enormous incisors appeared to support that image perfectly. Strong jaws, reinforced enamel, and massive teeth combined into a picture that seemed complete before further evidence entered the discussion. Few anatomical features have pointed so convincingly toward a single explanation. Even today, those fossils encourage the same instinctive interpretation. The teeth appear engineered for punishing contact with hard material, almost inviting comparisons with chisels, wedges, and heavy woodworking tools. Every ridge, every curve, and every muscle scar seems to reinforce that expectation. For many decades, the evidence appeared settled before the broader story of this extraordinary rodent had truly begun to emerge through careful study of the animal itself. Scientific understanding sometimes changes with a dramatic fossil discovery, and sometimes it changes because familiar bones begin revealing information they had been holding for thousands of years. Castoroides followed the second path. Its skeleton remained much the same as generations of researchers had known it, yet a new way of reading ancient chemistry transformed one of the oldest assumptions ever attached to this remarkable animal. Since the first fossil discoveries during 1837, scientists naturally compared the giant beaver with its closest living relatives. Living beavers cut trees, strip bark, gather branches, and construct dams and lodges from wood. An extinct relative, equipped with even larger incisors, appeared destined for the same lifestyle. The resemblance seemed persuasive enough that the idea settled into scientific literature for well over a century, repeated through museum exhibits, illustrations, and textbooks without much reason for doubt. A different picture finally emerged during 2019. Research led by Tessa Plint at Western University in Canada examined the chemistry preserved within fossil bones, using stable isotope analysis to reconstruct the diet of Castoroides directly instead of inferring it from appearance. Stable isotopes are forms of the same chemical element that contain different numbers of neutrons. As animals eat throughout life, those subtle chemical patterns become incorporated into bone collagen, leaving behind a lasting dietary record that can survive for many thousands of years. The research team analyzed bone collagen from 11 Castoroides specimens collected across its former range. Each sample preserved chemical signatures reflecting the foods that had nourished the animal over many years. Those signatures could then be compared with the patterns produced by different categories of vegetation, allowing scientists to distinguish between woody plants growing above the water and softer aquatic plants growing below the surface. The results overturned decades of confident expectation. There was no meaningful evidence that woody vegetation or terrestrial browse contributed substantially to the diet. Instead, the chemical record consistently pointed toward submerged aquatic macrophytes, including underwater plants, marsh grasses, and other soft vegetation rooted across shallow lake beds and wetlands. The giant beaver emerged from the analysis as a marsh grazer instead of a tree cutter. Plint summarized the finding plainly, explaining that the study found no evidence the giant beaver cut down trees or ate them for food. The research also concluded that giant beavers were not ecosystem engineers in the same way as the modern North American beaver. Those words reshaped the entire conversation surrounding Castoroides because they separated appearance from behavior with remarkable clarity. Its enormous incisors suddenly required a different explanation. Tough aquatic vegetation often contains abundant silica, tiny mineral particles absorbed from surrounding sediments. Such plants become surprisingly abrasive after constant exposure to mud and suspended grit. Processing this material day after day demanded durable teeth reinforced against heavy wear, together with exceptionally strong jaws capable of grinding through coarse stems and fibrous underwater growth. The broad ridges and reinforced enamel fit this demanding diet far better than they fit the familiar image of tree felling. The study also encouraged scientists to reconsider another long accepted assumption. No confirmed evidence demonstrates that Castoroides built dams or lodges. A possible lodge-like structure, discovered near New Knoxville, Ohio, during the early 1900s, has never received convincing confirmation, leaving its origin uncertain. Viewed through the lens of isotope evidence, that uncertainty carries greater significance. The giant beaver occupied the wetlands as a specialized grazer, drawing its living from an environment it depended upon instead of reshaping it through construction. One discovery in fossil chemistry changed an entire animal. Some animals alter the places where they live so completely that the landscape begins carrying their signature. Others spend their entire existence fitting themselves into conditions they did not create. Castoroides belong to the second group. The difference appears subtle at first, though it shaped every part of its relationship with the wetlands that sustained it. Among living mammals, the modern North American beaver stands as one of the world's most influential keystone species. A keystone species is an organism whose activities reshape the surrounding environment in ways that affect countless other forms of life. When a beaver family settles along a stream, the changes extend far beyond the animals themselves. Trees are harvested, channels are blocked, ponds expand, and flowing water slows into broad pools that support fish, amphibians, insects, waterfowl, and aquatic plants. The surrounding water table often rises as moisture spreads into nearby soils, allowing entirely new communities of organisms to flourish. These engineered wetlands also influence the global carbon cycle. Across the world, beaver wetlands are estimated to store roughly 470,000 tons of carbon each year. Waterlogged soils slow the breakdown of plant material, allowing carbon to remain trapped within wetland sediments instead of returning quickly to the atmosphere. A creature weighing little more than many household dogs can gradually transform an entire valley through countless small acts of construction. Castoroides followed another path entirely. The chemical evidence preserved within its bones indicates that it relied upon existing marshes filled with aquatic vegetation. No confirmed evidence demonstrates that it felled trees, assembled dams, or created artificial ponds. The wetlands supplying its food already existed through natural flooding, changing river channels, and the movement of glacial waters across the continent. Instead of reshaping those places, the giant beaver lived within them as they were. Its body reflected that dependence. Short, heavy limbs served well in water, but offered little efficiency across long distances on land. Traveling from one wetland to another would have demanded more effort than it does for the modern North American beaver, whose behavior allows it to establish new ponds whenever suitable streams are available. Castoroides depended upon remaining close to productive marshes, where food, protection, and movement through water remained closely connected. Ecologists describe such animals as habitat specialists. A habitat specialist requires a narrow range of environmental conditions and performs best when those conditions remain stable. The opposite strategy belongs to habitat generalists, species capable of thriving across many different settings because they adjust their behavior with greater flexibility. Modern beavers approach that broader strategy through engineering. If water flows too swiftly, they build structures that reduce its speed. Should a pond disappear, they often create another by modifying the landscape itself. Castoroides possessed no comparable ability to manufacture favorable surroundings. Productive wetlands had to exist before it could occupy them, and their continued health determined the animal's future. Every generation inherited the same dependence upon shallow freshwater habitats rich in aquatic vegetation. Success rested upon finding those places and remaining within them. This distinction separates two close relatives more clearly than outward appearance ever could. One transformed rivers into wetlands through persistent construction. The other accepted the landscape as it found it, drawing nourishment from an ecosystem built by geology, climate, and water. The giant beaver flourished while those conditions endured, carrying its immense body through habitats that shaped every day of its existence without ever being shaped in return. Every shoreline where Castoroides fed belonged to a neighborhood unlike any living landscape. The marshes did not exist in isolation, surrounded only by familiar birds and modest mammals. They formed one part of an astonishing community where immense herbivores, formidable predators, and unusual grazers crossed paths across the same continent. More than 70% of the large mammal genera living in North America during the Pleistocene would eventually disappear, taking with them one of the richest collections of giant animals the continent has ever supported. Across northern plains and open valleys wandered the woolly mammoth. Towering as much as 13 feet at the shoulder and weighing close to 13,000 pounds, these great elephants traveled from Alaska through broad regions, reaching as far as the Ohio Valley. Thick coats protected them through cool climates, while sweeping tusks curved forward in graceful arcs. Herds moved steadily across grasslands and open country, leaving broad trails through landscapes that still held abundant freshwater habitats nearby. Closer to wooded country lived another giant relative of elephants, the mastodon. Although somewhat smaller than the mammoth, the mastodon carried a heavier build and favored browsing among shrubs and trees instead of grazing broad grasslands. Fossils of mastodons frequently appear in the same Great Lakes deposits that preserve the remains of Castoroides, showing that these enormous herbivores often occupied neighboring environments, divided only by differences in vegetation and water. Predators matched the scale of their prey. The short-faced bear, Arctodocimus, ranks among the largest terrestrial mammalian hunters ever to inhabit North America. standing more than 6 feet at the shoulder while moving on all fours and weighing somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds. It combined exceptional height with long limbs suited for traveling considerable distances. Whether searching for weakened animals, defending scavenged carcasses, or pursuing opportunities across open country, its presence shaped the behavior of many other species. Another famous hunter, Smilodon, carried a very different design. Weighing as much as 600 pounds, this saber-toothed cat possessed upper canine teeth approaching 11 inches in length. Powerful forelimbs allowed it to grapple large prey before delivering carefully placed bites. Though often imagined as roaming endless grasslands, many populations likely hunted among mixed habitats where cover provided opportunities for close ambush. Large herbivores appeared in remarkable variety. Giant ground sloths, including Megatherium and Megalonyx, stretched nearly 13 feet in length and could rise to browse high branches unreachable to many other mammals. Native American horses belonging to the genus Equus grazed across open country long before later reintroduction by Spanish colonizers. Stag moose, known as Cervulus scotti, carried antlers spreading nearly 8 feet across, surpassing those of any living moose. Giant bison, identified as Bison latifrons, bore sweeping horns extending roughly 7 feet from tip to tip, creating one of the most impressive silhouettes in the Ice Age grasslands. Within this remarkable assembly, Castoroides occupied its own distinctive place. Fossils have been recovered alongside the remains of stag moose, flat-headed peccaries, and short-faced bears, preserving moments when these very different animals shared the same regions. Their bones rest together because their lives once overlapped across a continent overflowing with biological richness. The Pleistocene was not an impoverished world awaiting modern life. It represented an extraordinary age when North America supported a diversity of large mammals unmatched anywhere on the continent today. Few fossil discoveries challenge familiar expectations as completely as the realization that the giant beaver did not replace the modern North American beaver, nor did the smaller animal appear only after its larger relative vanished. For a remarkably long span of the Pleistocene, both inhabited the same continent at the same time, moving through many of the very same wetlands while following lives that rarely crossed in direct competition. Although their shared appearance suggests a close family relationship, the connection reaches much farther into the past than many people imagine. The North American beaver, Castor canadensis, is not descended from Castoroides. Their evolutionary lines separated roughly 16 to 20 million years ago, leaving each branch to develop along its own path. That long period of independent evolution produced differences substantial enough that scientists place them within entirely separate subfamilies, despite the unmistakable resemblance that first inspired their comparison. Those millions of years gradually shaped two distinct solutions to life in freshwater environments. One lineage refined the remarkable engineering behavior associated with living beavers today. The other evolved toward immense body size, while remaining closely tied to naturally occurring marshes filled with aquatic vegetation. By the time both animals shared North America, they resembled distant cousins whose similarities reflected ancient ancestry rather than recent kinship. Their coexistence lasted for tens of thousands of years. Fossil evidence shows that both species occupied overlapping regions across the continent, sometimes living within the same broad wetland systems. Such prolonged overlap would seem difficult if they depended upon identical resources. In nature, direct competition between closely related animals often favors one species over another, eventually forcing separation or decline. The persistence of both beavers suggests a different arrangement. Their diets reveal why that balance endured. Modern North American beavers relied heavily upon woody vegetation and terrestrial browse, harvesting branches, bark, and shoots from the edges of streams and ponds. Castoroides, as stable isotope research demonstrated, concentrated on submerged aquatic plants growing across shallow water. Even while sharing the same marsh, each animal gathered nourishment from a different layer of the habitat. Food that sustained one held little importance for the other. Body size further emphasized those contrasting lifestyles. The modern beaver of the Pleistocene remained noticeably smaller than its descendant populations today, generally weighing somewhere between 25 and 75 pounds. Beside a mature Castoroides approaching several hundred pounds, it would have appeared surprisingly modest. The difference extended beyond appearance, influencing movement, feeding behavior, and the role each animal played within the same landscape. It is possible to imagine both occupying a single pond without interfering with one another. Near the shoreline, the smaller beaver selected young trees, carried branches through the water, and strengthened its lodge with fresh timber. Farther into the shallows, the giant beaver moved steadily among dense stands of aquatic vegetation, cropping stems rooted beneath the surface. Their paths occasionally crossed, yet their daily needs remained remarkably different. Ecologists describe this arrangement as niche separation. Species sharing the same environment avoid constant competition by specializing in different resources, behaviors, or spaces within that habitat. Instead of struggling over identical food supplies, each occupies its own ecological role, allowing both populations to persist across long periods. The shared wetlands of Pleistocene North America therefore supported two beavers connected by ancestry but separated by strategy. One reshaped its surroundings through construction, adapting the landscape to its needs whenever conditions changed. The other flourished within wetlands already formed by natural forces, drawing its entire existence from places it could inhabit but never recreate. For thousands of years, both approaches succeeded, each following its own enduring course through the same waters. Longevity leaves its own kind of fossil. It is recorded not in a single skeleton, but in the repeated appearance of the same animal across layers of earth separated by immense stretches of time. Again and again, Castoroides returns, occupying changing landscapes without disappearing from them. That enduring presence reveals a creature whose way of life remained remarkably successful through one of the most dynamic periods in Earth's recent history. The oldest known members of this lineage reach back approximately 1.4 to 3 million years, with the earlier species, Castoroides dilophodus, known from Florida. From those beginnings, giant beavers occupied North America through an interval that witnessed repeated advances and retreats of continental ice. Their story extended across more than 2 million years, an achievement shared by relatively few large mammals. The Pleistocene is often imagined as one uninterrupted age of expanding glaciers, although the reality was far more rhythmic. Ice sheets grew, then receded. Wetlands shifted across the landscape. Rivers changed course. Forests spread, then contracted, while grasslands advanced into newly opened country. Each cycle reshaped the continent, yet those transformations unfolded again and again without ending the existence of the giant beaver. Among the most demanding intervals came the last glacial maximum, reaching its greatest extent, roughly between 20,000 and 18,000 years ago. During that time, enormous ice sheets covered much of Canada beneath ice approaching a mile in thickness. Conditions near those frozen margins became challenging for countless species, yet Castoroides endured. Instead of disappearing, populations persisted within refugia, regions south of the continental ice, where wetlands remained capable of supporting freshwater communities through the coldest phases of the climate cycle. Those refuges acted as reservoirs of life. As glaciers gradually withdrew during warmer intervals, freshwater habitats expanded across newly exposed terrain. Castoroids followed those returning wetlands northward, reclaiming regions that had previously rested beneath ice. Fossils recovered from the Old Crow Basin in the Yukon demonstrate this remarkable expansion. Specimens dating to approximately 130,000 years ago belong to a warm interglacial period, showing that giant beavers occupied far northern environments whenever favorable conditions returned. Such movement required neither extraordinary speed nor dramatic behavioral innovation. The wetlands themselves shifted across the continent, and Castoroides expanded alongside them whenever suitable habitat became available. Across many cycles of cooling and warming, this pattern repeated with remarkable consistency, allowing the species to remain widespread despite continual environmental change. Viewed across millions of years, survival on this scale cannot reasonably be dismissed as fortune. A lucky species does not persist through repeated continental transformations while maintaining a broad geographic range. Castoroids succeeded because its ecological strategy functioned exceptionally well under the conditions that repeatedly characterized the Pleistocene. Healthy marshes supplied dependable food, abundant water, and protection that supported generation after generation across changing climates. Its long history also argues against the image of a fragile giant lingering at the edge of extinction. Fossils recovered from widely separated regions reveal an animal that remained both common and geographically successful for an extraordinary span of time. It occupied wetlands from the southeastern reaches of the continent to northern landscapes whenever expanding freshwater systems allowed. For much of the Pleistocene, Castoroides stood among North America's established large mammals, not as a temporary experiment, but as a durable participant in one of the richest ecosystems the continent has ever known. Its eventual disappearance would arise from a change unlike the many cycles it had already survived, one directed toward the very foundation upon which its enduring success depended. Earth's climate does not always change at the same pace. At certain moments, thousands of years drift past with gradual transformation. At others, the entire character of a continent shifts within the span of a few human generations. Near the close of the Pleistocene, North America entered one of those extraordinary intervals, a sequence of rapid reversals that reshaped rivers, wetlands, forests, and the countless lives connected to them. Around 14,700 years ago, the world emerged from the grip of the last glacial maximum. Temperatures climbed as immense continental ice sheets gradually withdrew toward the north. Meltwater poured across broad landscapes, rivers expanded, and freshwater habitats spread into regions that had long rested beneath ice. For many species, including Castoroides, these changing conditions remained familiar. Similar advances and retreats had unfolded repeatedly during the preceding millions of years, and the giant beaver had weathered them successfully. Then the rhythm changed. Approximately 12,900 years ago, North America entered the Younger Dryas, one of the most abrupt cooling events recognized in the geological record. Temperatures plunged across much of the continent within only decades, and some scientific evidence suggests that certain regions may have experienced dramatic shifts within only a few years. Conditions returned to something closely resembling a glacial climate. interrupting the broader warming trend that had already begun. The Younger Dryas endured for roughly 1,200 years. During that interval, glaciers stabilized or advanced in some regions, plant communities adjusted once again, and freshwater systems responded to renewed cold. Species already adapted to fluctuating climates persisted through another familiar chapter in the Pleistocene cycle. Castoroides continued occupying suitable wetlands, drawing nourishment from aquatic vegetation as it had through countless earlier environmental transitions. Its conclusion proved even more remarkable than its beginning. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended with astonishing speed. Ice core records from Greenland indicate that temperatures there climbed by roughly 18 degrees Fahrenheit within only a few decades. Among the climatic transitions documented during the past 100,000 years, this stands as one of the most rapid ever identified. Entire ecosystems faced conditions unlike the gradual changes that had characterized many earlier shifts. The transformation extended beyond warmer air. As the early Holocene developed, increasing aridity spread across much of the interior of North America. Rainfall patterns shifted, evaporation intensified, and groundwater levels gradually declined in many regions. Marshes that had endured through repeated glacial cycles began shrinking. Some drained completely, while others became increasingly seasonal, losing the dependable water that had sustained complex wetland communities over immense spans of time. These hydrological changes reached directly into the foundation of the giant beaver's existence. Aquatic macrophytes flourish where shallow freshwater remains stable throughout the growing season. Their roots anchor within submerged sediments, while stems and leaves depend upon permanent water instead of temporary flooding. As ponds contracted and wetlands fragmented, those underwater plant communities declined with them. Productive feeding grounds became fewer, smaller, and increasingly isolated across the landscape. Unlike the climatic oscillations that had come before, this sequence altered the continuity of the habitats themselves. Water lingered for shorter periods, marsh vegetation changed, and the mosaic of connected wetlands that had once stretched across broad regions became increasingly broken apart. For an animal whose ecological success rested upon permanent freshwater environments, every disappearing marsh represented more than a change in scenery. It marked the gradual reduction of the living foundation that had sustained Castoroides across more than 2 million years of remarkable persistence. Extinction often begins long before the last individual vanishes. It starts when familiar places become less dependable, season after season, until the landscape no longer offers what a species requires to complete the ordinary rhythms of life. For Castoroides, that gradual unraveling centered upon the wetlands that had sustained its lineage across millions of years of environmental change. With the beginning of the early Holocene, around 11,700 years ago, North America entered a climate unlike the one that had shaped most of the giant beaver's history. Temperatures remained warmer, while many interior regions became noticeably drier. Lakes, marshes, and shallow floodplains still existed, yet their distribution steadily changed. Areas that had once supported extensive freshwater vegetation began contracting as water levels fell and seasonal patterns shifted across broad portions of the continent, particularly throughout the Great Lakes region. Among the first organisms to respond were the submerged aquatic macrophytes that formed the foundation of the giant beaver's diet. These underwater plants flourish only under a narrow range of conditions. They depend upon stable water depth, sufficient clarity for sunlight to reach their leaves, moderate temperatures, and sediments that remain covered throughout the growing season. Even relatively modest alterations in water level or seasonal drying can reduce their abundance or eliminate them from an entire wetland. As shorelines gradually retreated, shallow feeding grounds disappeared. Wetlands became smaller and increasingly fragmented, breaking apart once continuous networks of aquatic vegetation into scattered patches, separated by stretches of unsuitable habitat. Some marshes survived, while others transformed into environments that no longer supported the dense underwater plant communities upon which Castoroides depended. The giant beaver did not lose its food all at once. Instead, the places where that food grew became fewer with each passing generation. Its own anatomy limited possible responses. A heavy body supported by comparatively short limbs functioned effectively in freshwater habitats, though extended travel across dry ground demanded greater effort and exposed the animal to additional hazards. Reaching another suitable marsh often required crossing landscapes that offered little nourishment and less protection. As productive wetlands became increasingly isolated from one another, every journey carried greater energetic cost. Living beavers possess an advantage that fundamentally changes this equation. When streams become too shallow or seasonal conditions reduce available water, they frequently build dams that expand ponds and restore favorable habitat. Their engineering creates new aquatic environments capable of supporting food resources and shelter even when natural conditions become less reliable. In many situations, they solve the problem by altering the landscape itself. No evidence suggests that Castoroides possessed a comparable strategy. The giant beaver remained dependent upon wetlands created and maintained by natural processes. If water levels declined beyond the tolerance of aquatic vegetation, there was no confirmed behavior capable of restoring those feeding grounds. Every shrinking marsh represented a permanent loss unless broader environmental conditions reversed. The findings published during 2019 expressed this dependence with unusual clarity. The researchers concluded that the giant beaver's specialized diet rendered it highly dependent upon wetland habitat for survival. Those words summarize more than feeding preferences. They describe an ecological commitment that had served the species exceptionally well throughout the Pleistocene until the character of freshwater landscapes changed in a direction that offered progressively fewer opportunities for recovery. As wetlands contracted, the underwater meadows diminished beside them. The giant beaver faced no hidden reserve of alternative foods and no reliable means of creating replacement habitat. Its world narrowed one marsh at a time, until the living network that had sustained countless generations could no longer sustain the species itself. The final chapters of the giant beaver's history unfolded during another remarkable arrival. As wetlands shifted across North America, people also entered the continent, carrying new tools, new knowledge, and new ways of living within unfamiliar landscapes. Their appearance has long inspired one of the most enduring debates in Ice Age science, raising the possibility that human hunters helped bring an end to many of the continent's largest animals. Current evidence indicates that humans reached North America in substantial numbers approximately 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. They traveled from Siberia across Beringia, a broad land connection between Siberia and Alaska, exposed when lower sea levels revealed ground now submerged beneath the ocean. From there, populations gradually expanded throughout the continent, adapting to environments that ranged from open grasslands to forests, river valleys, and freshwater marshes. Among these early inhabitants, the Clovis people remain the best documented. Their name comes from distinctive fluted stone spear points first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico. These carefully crafted tools appear across many archaeological sites and are frequently associated with the remains of large Ice Age mammals. Such discoveries established the Clovis culture as highly capable hunters, familiar with pursuing animals far larger than themselves. Castoroides and these early people clearly occupied some of the same regions. Fossil remains of the giant beaver have been recovered from Sheridan Cave in Ohio alongside Paleo-Indian artifacts and the bones of other extinct mammals. This evidence demonstrates that humans and giant beavers shared portions of the landscape during the closing stages of the Pleistocene. Their lives overlapped in both time and place, making encounters entirely possible. Yet proximity alone does not demonstrate hunting. Despite many decades of research, no confirmed kill site has ever been identified for Castoroides. Scientists have not discovered giant beaver bones bearing unmistakable cut marks made during butchering. Neither have they uncovered remains directly associated with stone weapon points in a hunting context. Compared with several other extinct mammals, the evidence connecting humans directly to the death of giant beavers remains surprisingly limited. This uncertainty lies at the heart of the overkill hypothesis, the proposal that human hunting drove North America's great mammals toward extinction. For more than 50 years, researchers have debated the idea vigorously, comparing archaeological discoveries, fossil records, ecological models, and climatic evidence. Different species appear to fit the hypothesis with varying degrees of confidence, suggesting that no single explanation applies equally across the entire Ice Age fauna. For Castoroides, several factors weaken the case for overkill as the primary cause. Its semi-aquatic lifestyle, limited opportunities for pursuit compared with large grazing mammals crossing open country. An adult giant beaver also presented a formidable challenge. Massive incisors, powerful jaws, and substantial body size would have made close encounters risky for hunters armed with stone weapons. Capturing such an animal would likely have demanded favorable circumstances rather than routine pursuit. Most researchers today favor a broader explanation built from several interacting pressures. Habitat loss reduced the wetlands that supported specialized feeding. Shrinking marshes divided populations into smaller, isolated groups. Ecological relationships changed as freshwater environments disappeared. Human hunting may have added further pressure to populations already diminished by environmental transformation, especially if isolated survivors became easier to locate within the remaining wetlands. That combined view best reflects the available evidence while recognizing its limits. Castoroides appears most likely to have declined because the habitats sustaining its unique way of life gradually disappeared, with opportunistic hunting perhaps contributing during its final centuries. Even so, the fossil record preserves only scattered fragments of an immense story. Some answers remain beyond recovery, and the complete sequence of events that ended the giant beaver's long history may never be known with certainty. Every extinct animal survives through fragments. A tooth preserved in ancient sediment, a jaw resting within peat, or a skeleton emerging from layers of earth becomes the beginning of an entirely new story. The giant beaver entered scientific history in exactly that way, revealing itself piece by piece until a creature that had disappeared thousands of years earlier slowly returned to view. The first known Castoroides fossil was discovered during 1837 in a peat bog in Licking County, Ohio. That discovery eventually inspired the species name ohioensis, honoring the state where science first encountered this remarkable rodent. The specimen consisted largely of the jaw and enormous incisor teeth. Even without the rest of the skeleton, those distinctive features carried unmistakable clues. Early naturalists recognized the specialized rodent dentition, allowing them to place the animal within the rodent family despite confronting proportions unlike anything then living. Its size challenged belief. A beaver with incisors, far larger than those of any modern species, seemed almost implausible. Without a complete skeleton, researchers struggled to imagine how such an animal had been built. Individual bones, recovered from different locations, hinted at exceptional body dimensions, although the overall form remained uncertain for many decades. By around 1900, paleontologists had assembled the first reasonably complete skeleton. For the first time, the enormous skull, broad body, powerful limbs, and shortened proportions could be studied together instead of as isolated discoveries. The reconstruction transformed scientific understanding. Castoroides no longer existed merely as oversized teeth and scattered bones. It emerged as a complete animal with recognizable anatomy, allowing comparisons with living beavers and other extinct rodents to become far more reliable. As additional excavations continued, a pattern gradually appeared across the fossil record. Discoveries accumulated most frequently throughout the American Midwest, particularly in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and the states surrounding the Great Lakes. Those concentrations reflected regions where ancient wetlands preserved bones exceptionally well, and where later geological conditions exposed them for discovery. Even so, the true range of the giant beaver extended well beyond the places yielding the greatest number of fossils. Evidence from the Old Crow Basin in the Yukon demonstrates that Castoroides reached subarctic Canada during warmer intervals, occupying freshwater habitats far to the north whenever suitable conditions returned after glacial retreat. Equally important are fossils from Florida belonging to the earlier species, Castoroides dilophodus. Those southern remains reveal that the genus possessed a history extending roughly 1.4 million years into the past within the southeastern portion of the continent, showing that giant beavers flourished across remarkably different regions during their long existence. Yet every remarkable discovery also highlights what remains absent. Fossils preserve bones exceptionally well, though soft tissues almost never survive across such immense spans of time. No skin, muscles, internal organs, or fur have been recovered from castoroids. As a result, several familiar details remain matters of informed scientific interpretation rather than direct observation. Its tail provides one of the clearest examples. Some researchers favor a broad, flattened tail resembling that of modern beavers, while others suggest a narrower form more comparable to the muskrat. The exact color of its coat, the texture of its skin, and many aspects of its swimming movements must likewise be inferred from living relatives instead of preserved evidence. Even the nature of its shelter remains unresolved. Whether the giant beaver constructed lodges, excavated burrows, occupied bank dens, or relied upon another strategy altogether has never been demonstrated conclusively. A structure reported from Ohio during 1912 attracted considerable interest, yet later study never confirmed that it truly belonged to Castoroides. Across nearly 2 centuries of research, the giant beaver remains both familiar and incomplete, known through extraordinary fossils, while still holding part of its life beyond the reach of certainty. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries about vanished animals come without uncovering a single new skeleton. A fragment of fossil bone already resting inside a museum collection can reveal an entirely different story once examined with methods unavailable to earlier generations. During 2019, such a moment transformed scientific understanding of Castoroides, replacing long accepted assumptions with direct chemical evidence preserved inside the animal itself. Stable isotope analysis has become one of the most powerful techniques in modern paleontology because it allows researchers to reconstruct ancient diets from the chemistry of fossil bone instead of relying only upon tooth shape, jaw structure, or comparisons with living relatives. Scientists examine chemical signatures incorporated into the skeleton during life. Those signatures provide a lasting record of what an animal consumed over many years. The principle depends upon isotopes, atoms belonging to the same element that contain different numbers of neutrons. Carbon and nitrogen each occur in several naturally occurring forms. Plants growing in different environments absorb these forms in slightly different proportions. Animals feeding upon those plants gradually incorporate the same chemical patterns into the collagen of their own bones. As bone continually grows and renews throughout life, those dietary signals become part of its internal structure. Remarkably, many of those isotope ratios remain chemically stable for tens of thousands of years. Even after an animal dies and its skeleton becomes buried, enough original collagen may survive for careful laboratory analysis. When preservation is favorable, researchers can measure those ancient chemical patterns with extraordinary precision, allowing the diets of extinct species to be reconstructed long after every leaf they consumed has vanished. The landmark investigation was led by researcher Tessa Plint and colleagues at Western University. Their study examined 11 Castoroides specimens, forming the largest isotopic analysis ever conducted for the genus. Rather than interpreting the giant beaver in isolation, the team compared its chemical signatures with those of living North American beavers, muskrats, and established dietary categories representing terrestrial vegetation, emergent wetland plants, and fully submerged aquatic vegetation. The living North American beaver produced exactly the pattern scientists expected. Its carbon and nitrogen isotope values reflected a diet centered upon woody browse from trees and shrubs together with plants growing above the water surface. Those chemical signatures agreed closely with decades of direct ecological observation, confirming that the analytical method accurately distinguished feeding strategies among modern freshwater mammals. Castoroides produced an entirely different result. Its isotope ratios consistently aligned with submerged aquatic macrophytes, plants rooted underwater that complete their growth beneath the surface instead of emerging into the air. The giant beaver's bones carried no chemical indication that woody browse formed a major component of its diet. For one of the first times, researchers possessed direct evidence rather than anatomical inference, explaining how this enormous rodent actually lived. The investigation reached beyond diet alone. Radiocarbon dating applied to the fossil material established a clearer timeline for the northward expansion of Castoroides following the retreat of continental ice after the last glacial maximum. As glaciers withdrew and suitable wetlands developed across newly exposed landscapes, giant beavers expanded alongside those freshwater habitats, closely tracking the availability of environments capable of supporting their specialized feeding strategy. Together, these findings reshaped nearly every major discussion surrounding Castoroides. They demonstrated that giant beavers and modern North American beavers occupied separate ecological roles instead of competing directly for food. More importantly, they revealed how deeply the giant beaver depended upon submerged wetland vegetation, a question that had persisted since the first fossils emerged from an Ohio peat bog finally received an answer written not in speculation, but in the enduring chemistry of ancient bone. Viewed through the span of geological time, the disappearance of Castoroides forms only one thread within a much larger tapestry of change. As the Pleistocene drew to a close, North America experienced one of the most profound biological reorganizations in its history. Species that had shared the continent for thousands of generations faded from the fossil record within a comparatively brief interval, leaving behind an ecosystem that no longer resembled the one they had helped shape. Paleontologists estimate that approximately 37 mammalian genera vanished during this transition. More than 70% of North America's megafauna disappeared within a geologically short period. An extraordinary pattern when compared with the slower background rhythm of extinction that usually characterizes mammalian evolution. These losses were distributed unevenly across the animal kingdom. Large species with specialized ecological requirements proved especially vulnerable, placing Castoroides squarely within the group most heavily affected. The list of vanished animals stretches across nearly every major habitat. Woolly mammoths disappeared from the great grasslands and open woodlands. Mastodons no longer browsed among forests and wetlands. Short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, American horses, camels, giant ground sloths, and stag moose all passed into extinction between roughly 13,000 and 10,000 years ago. Each belonged to a distinctive way of life that had evolved over immense spans of time, and each carried ecological influences extending far beyond its own survival. Such disappearances represented far more than missing names in the fossil record. Every large mammal interacted continuously with vegetation, soils, waterways, predators, scavengers, and countless smaller organisms. When one ecological role vanished, neighboring relationships also shifted. As additional species disappeared, those changes accumulated, producing consequences that reached across entire landscapes. Large herbivores had long influenced the balance between open country and expanding woodland. Mammoths broke branches, toppled young trees, and maintained broad feeding areas through constant browsing. Other herbivores, including Castoroides, within its freshwater environments, removed substantial amounts of vegetation while reshaping the plant communities upon which many smaller organisms depended. After these giants disappeared, woody plants spread more freely through many regions. Forests gradually expanded across portions of landscapes that had previously remained more open under sustained pressure from large browsing animals. Some researchers have suggested that these ecological transformations extended even further. Changing vegetation altered the movement of carbon through soils, plants, and the atmosphere. Different plant communities stored organic material in different ways, potentially influencing regional carbon cycling over long periods. Although scientists continue investigating the magnitude of these effects, the proposal illustrates how the disappearance of large mammals may have echoed through environmental systems far beyond the animals themselves. The fossil record preserves another striking pattern. Around 12,900 years ago, near the beginning of the Younger Dryas, animal diversity declined sharply across many North American deposits. Plant communities eventually recovered and diversified during the early Holocene as climate stabilized and new habitats developed. The mammals, however, tell a different story. Many of the great Ice Age lineages never returned, leaving permanent gaps within ecosystems that had once supported remarkable biological variety. By the time the Holocene settled into its long course, the continent had become something entirely new. Rivers continued to flow, forests matured, wetlands persisted where conditions allowed, and countless species flourished within the transformed landscape. Even so, the ecological framework differed fundamentally from the one inherited from the Pleistocene. Castoroides belonged to a community that had shaped North America for millions of years. Its disappearance formed part of a wider cascade whose effects continued long after the last giant beaver slipped from the fossil record, leaving behind a continent reorganized into a different living world. Long after bones settled into marshes and caves, another kind of record continued its journey through time. It traveled from one generation to the next by voice, carried within stories remembered, repeated, and refined across centuries. These traditions were not written into stone or preserved within fossil beds, yet they remain part of the history of North America, offering a different way of remembering a landscape once shared by people and remarkable animals. The overlap between humans and Castoroides was genuine, even if its exact duration remains uncertain. By the time people spread across North America, giant beavers still occupied portions of the continent. Fossil remains recovered from Sheridan Cave in Ohio, together with evidence of human habitation and the bones of other Ice Age mammals, demonstrate that these worlds intersected. Whether every community encountered the giant beaver directly can no longer be determined, though the possibility rests firmly within the available evidence. Among indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes and northeastern regions, oral traditions preserve accounts of extraordinary beavers whose size and influence extend far beyond those of living animals. The Innu, Mississaugas, Ojibwe, Cree, and Mi'kmaq each maintain traditions that include giant beavers as powerful figures within stories explaining the character of rivers, lakes, and the land itself. These narratives belong to living cultural traditions that continue to be shared today, carrying meanings that reach well beyond simple descriptions of wildlife. Within Nishnabek, or Anishinaabe, tradition, the giant beaver, known as Wabameek, appears as a world builder whose immense constructions transformed entire landscapes. Rivers changed direction, waters gathered behind enormous barriers, and familiar geography emerged through the actions of this extraordinary being. The beaver occupies a place within a larger understanding of how the land acquired its present form, where natural features and cultural memory remain closely connected. Mi'kmaq tradition preserves another striking account through the stories of the culture hero Glooskap. In one well-known narrative, Glooskap pursues a monstrous beaver whose immense dams stretched across the landscape so completely that they nearly linked lake and sea. The story tells of Glooskap striking the Great Barrier with an axe, releasing trapped waters and allowing rivers to flow once more. The resulting torrent is associated with the Reversing Falls, near present-day St. John, New Brunswick, weaving the familiar geography of the region into a story of transformation and renewal. Farther north, the Yamoria traditions of the Dene also describe giant beavers as formidable beings that shaped the country before a heroic figure subdued them. Within these accounts, the animals possess tremendous power, altering waterways and influencing the form of the land itself. They stand among the great forces present during an earlier age, remembered alongside other beings whose actions established the world inherited by later generations. These narratives are not casual tales about unusually large animals. They belong to cosmological traditions that explain relationships between people, waterways, and the surrounding environment. Their giant beavers function as agents of landscape transformation, linking natural features with cultural understanding through stories preserved across countless generations. Many scientists have noted an intriguing alignment between these traditions and modern ecological knowledge. Living beavers unquestionably reshape rivers by constructing dams, while the memory of an immense prehistoric relative may have become intertwined with those familiar observations. Whether these stories preserve distant cultural memories of encounters with Castoroides, combine remembered animals with living beaver behavior, or reflect symbolic understandings of landscape remains impossible to determine with certainty. Even so, they endure as another archive of the past, suggesting that the final traces of the giant beaver survived not only in fossil bone, but also in stories carried by human voices long after the animal itself had disappeared. An empty ecological place rarely remains unoccupied forever. When one species disappears, another sometimes expands into opportunities that were once unavailable, carrying forward only part of the older story while writing an entirely new one. After Castoroides vanished from North America, the surviving North American beaver continued into the Holocene alone, gradually becoming the continent's dominant architect of freshwater landscapes. The disappearance of the giant beaver did not leave freshwater habitats without rodents. The smaller species had already occupied its own distinctive ecological role for thousands of years, feeding on woody vegetation and constructing dams across streams and rivers. Freed from sharing the continent with its larger relative, the North American beaver expanded through suitable watersheds, eventually occupying an enormous geographic range extending across forests, plains, mountains, and northern wetlands. Long before widespread European settlement transformed the continent, beaver populations reached extraordinary abundance. Around 1600, before the fur trade expanded across North America, scientists estimate that between 60 million and 400 million beavers inhabited the continent. Their numbers varied among regions, though together they formed one of the most influential mammal populations ever recorded within a temperate ecosystem. Across millions of years, generations of beavers reshaped waterways through persistent engineering. Dams slowed flowing streams, ponds spread behind newly formed barriers, and water remained across floodplains that otherwise would have drained more rapidly. Channels wandered across valleys instead of cutting narrow paths, while saturated soils supported marshes, wet meadows, and complex mosaics of aquatic habitat. The resulting landscape differed profoundly from one lacking beaver activity. The influence of even a single colony can be remarkable. Researchers have documented colonies capable of transforming as much as 30 acres of surrounding terrain through dam construction and the maintenance of interconnected ponds. Rising water tables nourish vegetation beyond the pond margins, while newly flooded areas provide breeding grounds, shelter, and feeding opportunities for numerous birds, amphibians, fish, insects, reptiles, and mammals. Beaver engineering creates environmental conditions extending far beyond the animals themselves. Many of those associated organisms become deeply dependent upon these constructed wetlands. Studies indicate that approximately 25% of the species inhabiting beaver-created wetlands rely entirely upon those habitats for survival. Without the ponds, channels, and saturated soils maintained by beavers, suitable conditions disappear for a substantial portion of the local biological community. The engineer supports an entire neighborhood of life through its ordinary daily activities. That ecological influence became dramatically apparent after the expansion of the European fur trade. Between approximately 1600 and 1850, intensive trapping reduced North American beaver populations by more than 90%. Rivers once shaped by countless dams changed course, wetlands contracted, and floodplains dried across many watersheds. The effects extended far beyond the loss of a commercially valuable animal, altering hydrology and habitat over enormous portions of the continent. Recognition of those consequences has inspired a remarkable change in modern conservation. Beaver reintroduction programs now operate across North America and Europe, restoring populations to landscapes where they had long been absent. Their engineering helps retain water during drought, reduces wildfire risk by maintaining wetter corridors, and rebuilds habitats supporting many declining species. Scientists also estimate that wetlands created by modern beavers capture roughly 470,000 tons of carbon each year, contributing to long-term carbon storage within waterlogged soils. The beaver that survived the Pleistocene ultimately inherited a transformed continent. Its success rested upon flexibility, the ability to reshape waterways when natural conditions shifted instead of depending entirely upon habitats already in place. That behavioral difference, modest in appearance yet profound in consequence, allowed one lineage to continue shaping North America long after its giant relative had passed into memory. There are moments in science when the strongest evidence invites an equally careful imagination. Fossils establish what existed, chemistry reveals how an animal lived, and anatomy defines what its body could accomplish. Between those points lies a narrow space where researchers may consider possibilities without confusing them for facts. Castoroides occupies that space more than almost any other Ice Age mammal. Its incisors remain among the most striking ever evolved by a rodent. Measuring roughly 6 inches along their exposed length, they combined extraordinary strength with broad cutting surfaces marked by pronounced ridges. The jaws supporting them carried massive muscles capable of delivering tremendous force. Even though the fossil record offers no indication that giant beavers regularly harvested trees as modern beavers do, the mechanical ability to bite through substantial woody material almost certainly existed. That capability has encouraged thoughtful speculation among some paleontologists. The structure of the incisors appears suitable for more than clipping soft aquatic vegetation. Their broad shape and durable enamel could also have processed woody stems, thick reeds, or buried root systems when opportunities arose. Such occasional use would remain consistent with the chemical evidence demonstrating that submerged aquatic plants formed the overwhelming foundation of the animal's diet. Anatomy establishes what was physically possible, while isotopes reveal what happened most often. Construction presents an even more intriguing question. More than a century ago, investigators described a possible lodge near New Knoxville, Ohio. The reported structure consisted of small saplings arranged into a mound approximately 4 feet high and 8 feet across. If the feature truly belonged to Castoroides, it would indicate at least some capacity for gathering vegetation and arranging it into shelter. Even after decades of discussion, however, the evidence has never reached the standard required for scientific confirmation. The structure remains an interesting possibility rather than an accepted conclusion. That uncertainty leaves room for considering what a confirmed giant beaver engineering tradition might have meant. A rodent weighing roughly 220 pounds, equipped with powerful jaws and immense incisors, possessed physical resources exceeding those of any living beaver. If such an animal had routinely constructed dams, the resulting barriers might have reached dimensions beyond anything commonly produced today. Larger bodies can move heavier materials, and stronger bites can cut thicker branches, allowing engineering on a correspondingly greater scale. The environmental consequences of those hypothetical structures would have extended far beyond the dams themselves. Larger ponds could have retained greater volumes of water, supporting extensive marshes and broad floodplains while creating habitat for countless aquatic organisms. Seasonal water levels might have remained more stable, sediments would have accumulated differently, and freshwater communities could have developed around wetlands of exceptional size. Across suitable landscapes, repeated construction by many colonies might have influenced drainage patterns over considerable distances. There is, however, another perspective that emerges from everything learned during recent decades. Evolution supplied Castoroides with extraordinary physical equipment, yet natural selection shaped those tools within a different ecological pathway. Instead of becoming a prolific wood-cutting engineer, the giant beaver specialized in feeding upon underwater vegetation flourishing within wetlands already present. Its anatomy offered remarkable possibilities, though its behavior followed another course entirely. That contrast carries a gentle sense of unrealized potential. Castoroides possess the strength to become one of the greatest ecosystem engineers in Earth's history, at least in principle, yet every reliable line of evidence points toward another life. Evolution fashioned the tools of a world builder, and the giant beaver spent them grazing among submerged plants, leaving behind an inheritance defined as much by what never happened as by everything that truly did. A single remarkable animal can appear unique until the wider history of life comes into view. Castoroides occupied North American wetlands, yet its immense size belonged to a much broader evolutionary pattern repeated across distant continents and islands. Again and again, unrelated rodent lineages expanded far beyond the dimensions of their smaller ancestors, arriving at giant forms through separate journeys shaped by similar ecological conditions. South America produced some of the most impressive examples. Around 8 million years ago, the wetlands of what is now Venezuela supported Phoberomys pattersoni, an enormous rodent estimated to weigh as much as 200 pounds. Although separated from Castoroides by geography, ancestry, and time, it occupied a comparable lifestyle as a large grazer living among freshwater habitats. Much later, another South American giant, Neocaurus pinckneyi, reached weights between roughly 200 and 250 pounds. This oversized relative of today's capybara survived until approximately 11,000 years ago, sharing the closing chapters of the Ice Age with many other giant mammals. Across Eurasia, evolution followed another path towards similar results. There, the giant beaver Trogontherium flourished as a close relative of Castoroides within the same family while belonging to a different evolutionary lineage. Although each genus developed independently after diverging from a common ancestor, both achieved exceptional size and occupied comparable ecological roles in freshwater environments. Their resemblance illustrates how similar environmental pressures can guide separate branches of evolution toward closely related solutions. On Mediterranean islands, another variation emerged. Small rodents, arriving from nearby mainland populations, encountered isolated landscapes where predators were often scarce and ecological opportunities remained open. Across many generations, these colonists gradually evolved into giant rats, far exceeding the size of their ancestors. This recurring process, known as island gigantism, demonstrates that dramatic increases in body size can arise repeatedly when selective pressures favor larger forms instead of smaller, more vulnerable ones. Australia tells a parallel story through different mammals altogether. Rodents never became the dominant large herbivores there, yet giant koalas belonging to the genus Phascolarctos appeared alongside substantial marsupials whose ecological roles resembled those filled by giant rodents elsewhere. Although these animals belong to entirely different branches of the mammalian family tree, they reveal how comparable environments may encourage large plant-eating mammals to evolve from very different ancestral groups. Far from those continents, the Canary Islands supported another extraordinary lineage. Canariamis bravoi evolved into a giant rat unlike any living species, growing far larger than mainland relatives after long isolation. Fossil evidence indicates that these remarkable rodents disappeared soon after the arrival of humans, adding another chapter to the repeated pattern of large island mammals proving especially vulnerable when new pressures entered their habitats. The Caribbean also produced one of the largest rodents ever known. Amblyriza inundata reached an estimated weight approaching 200 pounds while inhabiting island environments where abundant resources and reduced predation encouraged remarkable growth. Like many other giant rodents, it ultimately vanished, leaving only fossil remains to document the extraordinary possibilities hidden within rodent evolution. Viewed together, these discoveries reveal an unmistakable trend. Whenever predation remained limited, food resources remained dependable, and enough evolutionary time passed, rodent body size repeatedly expanded. Separate continents, isolated islands, and unrelated lineages arrived at comparable outcomes, despite following different histories. Castoroides therefore stands as one expression of a recurring evolutionary principle rather than an isolated curiosity. Giant rodents appeared wherever circumstances favored them, demonstrating one of evolution's most dependable tendencies that similar ecological conditions can repeatedly guide very different animals toward remarkably similar forms across the living world. Extinction rarely arrives as a single event. It unfolds through shrinking ranges, scattered survivors, and fewer encounters between members of the same species. Generation after generation, familiar places grow farther apart until the remaining animals occupy only isolated fragments of what was once continuous habitat. By the closing chapters of Castoroides, the continent still held giant beavers, though their world had already become much smaller. The youngest confirmed Castoroides fossils date to approximately 10,000 or 11,000 years ago. By then, the decline had almost certainly been underway for centuries. Wetlands that had once connected broad populations had become increasingly fragmented as changing climate altered drainage patterns and freshwater vegetation. Instead of moving freely across extensive marshes and shallow lakes, surviving animals were likely confined to separated pockets where suitable conditions still persisted. Isolation carries consequences extending beyond geography. As populations become smaller, opportunities for breeding decline, and genetic diversity begins to diminish. Every generation inherits a narrower range of genetic variation than the one before. Harmful mutations become more difficult to eliminate, while beneficial traits capable of helping a species adjust to changing environments appear less frequently within the population. Even without additional environmental pressures, this gradual erosion of genetic diversity weakens the long-term resilience of any species. For Castoroides, those biological processes probably unfolded alongside the disappearance of neighboring populations. Wetlands separated by expanding forests, drying floodplains, or altered river systems could no longer exchange individuals often enough to maintain healthy genetic connections. Each remaining refuge became increasingly isolated, reducing the possibility that new animals might replenish declining local groups. The youngest fossils recovered so far suggest that some of the final populations endured around the Great Lakes, where extensive freshwater environments survived longer than many other regions. Additional late specimens have also been discovered within isolated areas farther south, places where favorable wetlands continued after surrounding landscapes had already changed. These refuges offered temporary sanctuary, though none could preserve the species indefinitely once the broader ecological network had unraveled. The surroundings inhabited by those final giant beavers would have differed profoundly from the landscapes occupied by their distant ancestors. Many familiar Ice Age mammals had already disappeared, leaving ecological communities unlike those that had existed for thousands of years. Waterways shifted, vegetation changed, and habitats supporting submerged aquatic plants became less dependable. Each surviving population occupied a continent already transformed into something increasingly unfamiliar. No evidence points toward a dramatic, final confrontation or a single catastrophic day marking the end of the species. Extinction usually leaves no such clear boundary. Somewhere within one remaining wetland, perhaps along the edge of a shallow pond or a slow moving channel, the final giant beaver carried out the ordinary routines of its life without any sign that an evolutionary lineage, millions of years old, had reached its closing moment. After that individual died, no younger generation remained to continue the story. Its body settled into mud rich with organic material. Layer upon layer of peat gradually accumulated above the skeleton, shielding many bones from decay through the passing millennia. Long after the surrounding landscape changed again, those remains endured beneath wetlands, lake sediments, and riverbank deposits, waiting beyond the memory of written history. Today, paleontologists occasionally uncover those preserved bones as erosion exposes ancient layers or careful excavation reaches buried peat. The skeletons emerge astonishingly complete after roughly 10,000 years, carrying within their teeth, collagen, and anatomy the final traces of a species that vanished without spectacle. The last giant beaver left no monument announcing its departure. It departed through the ordinary passage of life, while the earth preserved enough of its story for discovery many thousands of years later. The disappearance of a species leaves more behind than an empty place in a list of extinct animals. Every living creature participates in countless exchanges with the landscape surrounding it, many so ordinary that they pass unnoticed while they continue. Only after the participant is gone does the full outline of its influence begin to emerge, often through careful comparison with living ecosystems that still retain similar ecological relationships. Although evidence indicates that Castoroides did not reshape rivers through widespread dam construction, it almost certainly influenced freshwater habitats in another important way. As a very large grazer feeding upon submerged aquatic vegetation, it would have consumed substantial quantities of plant material each day. Continuous grazing by animals of that size helps prevent any single aquatic plant from spreading unchecked, allowing a greater variety of submerged vegetation to coexist while preserving patches of open water used by fish, waterfowl, amphibians, and countless smaller organisms. Movement alone would also have altered the character of these wetlands. A body weighing roughly 220 pounds, passing repeatedly through marshes and shallow lakes, pressed into soft sediments with every step. Mud shifted, organic material mixed into the water, and the upper layers of the wetland floor became disturbed. Such activity introduces oxygen into surface sediments, redistributes nutrients, and creates narrow passages through dense vegetation. Smaller animals frequently use pathways opened by larger species, gaining easier access to food, shelter, and breeding areas without expending the same energy required to move through thick aquatic growth. The influence of Castoroides probably continued after life had ended. A carcass of that size represented a remarkable concentration of nutrients within a freshwater environment. Scavengers, insects, microorganisms, turtles, fish, and other consumers would have gathered gradually as decomposition progressed. Nutrients stored within muscles, bones, and internal organs returned to surrounding soils and waters, nourishing many forms of life over an extended period. Ecologically, such an event resembles the role of whale falls in the ocean, where the body of a large animal supports an entire succession of organisms long after death. These interactions rarely leave unmistakable traces within fossils. Bones preserve anatomy, while sediments reveal ancient environments. Yet the countless daily exchanges between a grazing animal and its habitat often disappear without direct evidence. Modern ecology helps bridge that gap. Researchers studying large wetland herbivores consistently find that their feeding, movement, and nutrient cycling influence plant communities, water chemistry, and biological diversity in ways that continue long after populations decline or disappear. A useful comparison survives today within African river systems inhabited by hippopotamuses. Their grazing, daily travel between water and land, and continual redistribution of nutrients affect rivers so thoroughly that waterways lacking hippopotamuses function differently from those where the animals remain abundant. The comparison does not suggest that Castoroides behaved exactly like a hippopotamus. Instead, it illustrates a broader ecological principle that very large herbivores shape freshwater environments through ordinary routines repeated across countless days and seasons. When Castoroides disappeared, those routines ended as well. Another species never fully assumed the same combination of size, diet, and movement within North American wetlands. The visible traces faded quickly, while subtler consequences continued unfolding beyond the reach of fossils. For roughly 10,000 years, marshes and shallow lakes have existed without the presence of their largest grazing rodent, carrying forward ecosystems that remain complete in many respects, yet still missing an influence that evolved across millions of years and vanished with its final survivors. For an animal that disappeared roughly 10,000 years ago, Castoroides continues to offer new conversations with science. Its story has never rested inside a completed chapter. Instead, it grows little by little whenever another fossil emerges from saturated ground, carrying fresh evidence preserved through thousands of seasons beneath layers of peat, lake sediments, or ancient river deposits. Across the Great Lakes region, discoveries still occur with surprising regularity. Changing shorelines expose buried deposits, erosion reveals forgotten bones along stream banks, and carefully planned excavations uncover skeletons that have remained undisturbed since the closing years of the Ice Age. Some specimens consist of isolated teeth or fragments of skull, while others preserve large portions of the skeleton. Every recovery expands the geographical record, helping researchers trace where giant beavers once lived and how their range contracted during their final millennia. The tools used to study those remains have changed dramatically within recent decades. Scientific methods available today reveal information that earlier generations of paleontologists could scarcely have imagined recovering from fossil bones. Stable isotope analysis measures chemical signatures preserved within collagen, allowing researchers to reconstruct ancient diets with remarkable precision. Computed tomography scanning examines skulls without damaging them, producing detailed three-dimensional models that expose internal anatomy hidden within solid bone. These digital reconstructions provide opportunities to investigate structures that influence hearing, balance, and sensory processing. One study published during 2019 reshaped scientific understanding of Castoroides by analyzing stable isotopes from 11 individuals. Those chemical signatures strongly supported the conclusion that submerged aquatic plants formed the principal food source, replacing earlier ideas that giant beavers regularly harvested trees like their living relatives. Even so, 11 specimens represent only a small sample drawn from an animal that occupied much of North America for hundreds of thousands of years. Additional fossils collected from different regions and time periods may refine that interpretation or reveal greater ecological variation than currently recognized. Another scientific frontier remains even more ambitious. Researchers have not yet successfully recovered ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from Castoroides. The challenge is considerable because genetic material gradually breaks apart after death, leaving only tiny fragments that become increasingly difficult to reconstruct with age. Nevertheless, certain peat deposits provide cool, oxygen poor environments capable of preserving organic tissues better than many other fossil settings, offering cautious hope that recoverable genetic material may still exist. If ancient deoxyribonucleic acid were eventually obtained, many long standing questions could be examined with greater confidence. Genetic evidence could clarify the evolutionary relationship between Castoroides and modern beavers, reveal how isolated different populations became during their decline, and perhaps provide clues about immune system adaptations or other biological characteristics impossible to observe directly from fossilized bones alone. Such discoveries would complement anatomical evidence instead of replacing it, adding another layer to an already rich scientific record. Researchers also continue exploring the skull itself as a source of behavioral information. The size and shape of passages carrying nerves, the arrangement of structures surrounding the inner ear, and the proportions of the eye sockets all contribute evidence about how the giant beaver sensed its environment. Computer models built from computed tomography scans allow scientists to estimate visual capabilities beneath the water surface, evaluate hearing sensitivity, and better understand how this remarkable rodent experienced the wetlands it inhabited. Each newly discovered specimen contributes another point upon an expanding map of distribution, ecology, and extinction. The animal itself no longer walks through North American marshes, yet its scientific journey remains unfinished. Every fossil carries another fragment of evidence waiting to be read, reminding us that even after 10,000 years, the giant beaver continues to teach those willing to listen through stone, bone, and patient investigation. Few lives illustrate the balance between success and fragility more clearly than that of Castoroides. For nearly 2 million years, this remarkable rodent occupied an ecological role with extraordinary consistency. Its anatomy, behavior, and habitat formed a combination refined across countless generations until every major feature of its body matched the demands of a world rich in freshwater wetlands. By every ordinary measure used by evolution, it was a triumph. Its immense size suited life among broad marshes and shallow lakes where aquatic vegetation flourished. Strong limbs carried its weight efficiently through water, while powerful incisors and jaws processed the plants that sustained it. Movement across dry ground appears to have been comparatively limited, though that mattered little in landscapes where connected wetlands stretched across wide portions of the continent. Every characteristic complemented the others, creating an animal exceptionally fitted to one enduring environment. Evolution often rewards such refinement. Within a stable habitat, specialists frequently outperform more flexible competitors because every aspect of their biology concentrates upon solving a particular ecological challenge. Energy need not be divided among many different strategies. Instead, Natural selection gradually sharpens the features most useful under prevailing conditions. Across thousands upon thousands of generations, this process can produce organisms displaying remarkable efficiency within their chosen niche. Hidden within that success lies a quieter limitation. As specialization increases, alternative ways of living tend to disappear. Traits that no longer contribute to immediate survival receive less evolutionary attention, while behaviors suited to different environments may never develop at all. The organism becomes increasingly dependent upon the continued existence of the conditions that shaped it. Stability favors refinement, though refinement often narrows future possibilities. Castoroides appears to have reached precisely that point. Chemical evidence indicates a strong reliance upon submerged aquatic vegetation. Fossil distributions consistently associate the species with freshwater wetlands. Anatomical studies suggest an animal especially comfortable in water, yet less suited for prolonged travel across changing landscapes. None of these characteristics represented weaknesses, while wetlands remained widespread and dependable. Together, they formed a remarkably effective way of life during an exceptionally long chapter of Earth's history. The modern North American beaver followed another evolutionary path. It feeds upon many species of trees and shrubs while also consuming aquatic vegetation when available. Rivers, ponds, lakes, streams, and even coastal environments containing slightly salty water can all support living populations. Perhaps most importantly, modern beavers alter landscapes by constructing dams that create suitable habitat where little previously existed. Flexibility became one of their defining characteristics, allowing adjustment as environmental conditions shifted. Castoroides possessed no comparable reserve of ecological options. As wetlands contracted and freshwater plant communities changed, its highly refined adaptations offered fewer opportunities for adjustment. The same traits that had supported millions of years of success gradually became less effective within a rapidly changing world. Evolution had shaped the species for persistence under familiar conditions, not for abrupt transformation unfolding across only a few thousand years. There is a profound irony within that history. For nearly 2 million years, specialization represented the giant beaver's greatest advantage. During roughly 2,000 years of accelerated environmental change, the very qualities that had once secured its place became increasingly difficult to sustain. Evolution had done exactly what natural selection always does. It optimized the species for the world that existed at the time, not for every world that might someday arrive. When that long, familiar landscape disappeared, Castoroides remained exquisitely adapted to a home that no longer existed. The end of the Ice Age did more than erase familiar animals from the landscape. It also revealed a pattern that becomes clearer each time paleontologists compare the species that disappeared with those that endured. Extinction was uneven. Some lineages vanished completely, while others crossed the same environmental threshold and continued into the modern world. Their differences offer one of the clearest lessons preserved within the fossil record. Among the approximately 37 mammalian genera lost from North America near the close of the Pleistocene, many shared a common characteristic. They occupied highly specialized ecological roles. Some depended upon particular kinds of grasslands, others hunted a limited range of large prey, while still others relied upon very specific habitats or food sources. Their adaptations had served them well across thousands of generations, yet those same refinements became increasingly difficult to sustain as environments changed with unusual speed. Species that survived generally displayed greater dietary flexibility. Bison shifted among available grasses as plant communities changed. Deer browsed leaves, twigs, shrubs, and many other foods depending upon season and location. Elk combined grazing with browsing, allowing them to exploit habitats that varied from open country to woodland edges. Modern North American beavers also demonstrated broad feeding habits, consuming numerous species of trees, shrubs, and aquatic vegetation instead of depending almost entirely upon one ecological resource. Behavioral flexibility proved equally important. Survival favored animals capable of adjusting familiar routines when circumstances demanded new approaches. Altering feeding locations, changing seasonal movements, exploring unfamiliar habitats, or adopting different patterns of activity allowed many species to continue functioning even as the landscapes surrounding them transformed. Such behavioral versatility provided opportunities unavailable to animals whose lives depended upon repeating the same successful strategies generation after generation. Reproduction also influenced resilience. Smaller mammals generally produce offspring more frequently than larger species, allowing populations to recover more rapidly after periods of decline. When harsh winters, habitat disruption, disease, or predation reduced local numbers, species with faster reproductive cycles replaced lost individuals more efficiently. Larger animals reproducing at slower rates often required many years to rebuild populations, leaving them increasingly vulnerable whenever repeated environmental pressures occurred within relatively short intervals. Geography formed another important part of the equation. Species capable of following shifting habitats across broad regions retained opportunities even as climates reorganized ecosystems. Those restricted to highly specific environments possessed fewer options. If suitable conditions disappeared from one location, reaching another favorable habitat became increasingly difficult, particularly when surviving populations had already become isolated from one another. Ecological dependence gradually transformed into geographic confinement. The contrast between Castoroides and the modern North American beaver illustrates these principles with unusual clarity. Both belonged to the same family and shared the essential body plan of large aquatic rodents. Their paths diverged through the ways they interacted with their surroundings. The modern beaver modifies rivers, creates ponds, exploits many food sources, and occupies an impressive range of freshwater environments. Castoroides appears to have relied upon habitats already suited to its specialized lifestyle, thriving where those conditions existed while possessing fewer alternatives when they faded. Viewed across the continent, the Great Pleistocene extinction resembles a powerful ecological filter. It did not reward the strongest bodies, the largest size, or even the longest history of success. Instead, it favored organisms capable of responding when familiar conditions disappeared. Adaptability emerged as the defining quality carried through that period of profound environmental change. Castoroides remains one of evolution's finest examples of successful specialization, while its surviving relatives remind us that resilience often belongs to those prepared to live in more than one kind of world. Every landscape carries memories that extend far beyond human history. Hills, rivers, marshes, and grasslands preserve the accumulated influence of countless living creatures that shaped them across immense spans of time. Although the giant beaver disappeared thousands of years ago, the continent surrounding us still bears the imprint of ecological events set into motion during its lifetime and carried forward after its disappearance. Modern North America is, in many respects, the geography of a post-extinction world. The broad plains, winding river systems, and remaining wetlands did not emerge in isolation. For hundreds of thousands of years, they existed alongside mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, enormous predators, and large herbivores whose daily lives influenced soils, vegetation, waterways, and nutrient cycles. As those animals vanished, ecological relationships that had developed together gradually unraveled, allowing new communities to assemble upon the foundations left behind. The Great Plains provide one of the clearest reminders that ecosystems continue responding long after large animals decline. During the 19th century, commercial hunting reduced bison populations from many millions to only a tiny fraction of their former abundance. Scientists later discovered that the consequences extended far beyond the disappearance of a familiar grazer. Plant communities shifted, fire patterns changed, wildlife distributions altered, and the ecological character of the grasslands transformed in ways that required decades of careful study to understand. That episode offered a smaller reflection of processes that had unfolded at the end of the Pleistocene on a far greater scale. Across North America and Europe today, another chapter of ecological restoration is taking shape through modern beaver reintroduction programs. Conservation groups and wildlife managers have recognized that beavers create wetlands, supporting remarkable biological diversity while reducing erosion, storing water during drought, and slowing floodwaters after heavy rainfall. Returning these industrious rodents to suitable landscapes cannot recreate the vanished ice age, yet their activities restore ecological functions that many watersheds had gradually lost. Those efforts also carry a deeper historical meaning. Each restored pond, renewed marsh, or reconnected stream recalls a continent where freshwater ecosystems once supported an even richer community of large aquatic mammals. The engineering accomplished by modern beavers differs greatly from the grazing lifestyle of Castoroides, yet both belong to a much older story in which large rodents played influential roles within North American wetlands. Restoration today reflects an increasing appreciation that healthy ecosystems often depend upon the presence of animals, shaping their surroundings through ordinary daily activity. Many of the places where Castoroides once fed no longer resemble the environments preserved within the fossil record. Wetlands across Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio have been drained for agriculture, transformed into expanding suburbs, or redirected through engineered river channels. Roads cross former marshes without revealing the deep ecological history lying beneath their foundations. Homes, fields, and towns occupy landscapes that once supported one of the largest rodents ever to evolve, though few passing travelers recognize that inheritance. In that sense, the giant beaver remains part of the present. Its bones rest beneath familiar ground, while the consequences of its disappearance continue flowing through ecosystems altered long ago. We live downstream from an extinction, downstream both in time and in ecology, inheriting landscapes shaped first by the presence of remarkable Ice Age animals, and later by the spaces they left behind. Castoroides has vanished as a living species, yet its influence endures within the rivers, wetlands, and plains that continue carrying the echoes of a world that helped create the one we now call home. Memory has its own lifespan. Some events remain vivid for generations, while others gradually fade until they survive only as fragments carried within stories, landscapes, or scattered objects preserved by chance. 10,000 years is long enough for an entire living world to pass beyond direct human remembrance, leaving only traces that later generations must patiently gather together if they hope to understand what once existed. Human beings naturally measure the world against the conditions surrounding them during their own lifetime. Forests, rivers, wetlands, and familiar animals become the standard against which everything else is imagined. Each generation inherits that standard without realizing it has already been shaped by countless changes that occurred long before anyone alive could witness them. The result is a subtle shift in perception that accumulates across centuries until absence itself begins to appear ordinary. Ecologists describe this process as shifting baseline syndrome. Every generation accepts the environment it inherits as normal, even when that landscape contains only a portion of the biological richness known to earlier generations. As species disappear and ecosystems become simpler, expectations adjust. Children grow into adults, believing they have inherited the complete world, unaware that previous generations walked among a greater abundance of life. The baseline continues moving while remaining almost impossible to notice from within. Castoroides vanished before written history recorded its existence. No contemporary descriptions survive. No carved illustrations identify it with certainty, and no written observer ever described its movement through North American wetlands. Its existence reached the present primarily through fossilized bones preserved within ancient sediments and through the oldest oral traditions maintained by indigenous peoples whose ancestors experienced landscapes far closer to those inhabited by the giant beaver. Among the Nishnabek, stories preserving the memory of an enormous beaver endured across many generations. Spoken tradition became the vessel through which fragments of a distant ecological past continued traveling across time. Such knowledge depended upon careful listening, faithful retelling, and the enduring responsibility of each generation to pass inherited stories onward. Although shaped by cultural meaning rather than scientific method, these traditions preserved echoes of remarkable animals long after direct experience had disappeared. Western science approached the same mystery from another direction. During 1837, fossil discoveries revealed that an enormous beaver had once inhabited North America, introducing the species to scientific study nearly 10,000 years after its final populations disappeared. From that point onward, each newly recovered skeleton, tooth, and fragment of peat added another piece to an animal already absent from living memory for an extraordinary span of time. Neither tradition possessed every answer. Oral history preserved enduring cultural memory without fossil measurements or laboratory analysis. Paleontology reconstructed anatomy, ecology, and chronology from preserved remains without witnessing the living animal. Together, they approached the same vanished creature from different starting points, each contributing evidence unavailable to the other. Their paths occasionally converged upon the same remarkable conclusion that North America had once supported a giant beaver unlike anything alive today. Imagine carrying that awareness into familiar places. Marshes across Ohio, now bordered by roads, neighborhoods, and cultivated fields, once supported rodents weighing roughly 220 pounds, moving through shallow water with incisors measuring nearly 6 inches in length. The landscape itself has retained that history, even after memory faded. Remembering such creatures does more than restore one extinct species to our imagination. It reminds us that the ordinary world surrounding us is only the latest chapter of a much longer story, one whose earlier pages still rest within the earth, waiting to be read. Extinction can erase a species without erasing its family. Evolution rarely follows a single path, and while one branch may end, neighboring branches often continue growing into futures the vanished lineage never reached. Castoroides belongs to that kind of story. Its own evolutionary journey came to a close, yet the broader beaver family continued, carrying forward ancient traits that first appeared millions of years before the last giant beaver disappeared. Castoroides left no direct descendants. It represented the final chapter of a distinct evolutionary branch that had persisted for nearly 3 million years before reaching its conclusion near the close of the Pleistocene. Once those last populations vanished, no closely related species remained to inherit that particular combination of anatomy, ecology, and behavior. An entire lineage ended, leaving only fossils to record its existence. The family to which it belonged, however, survived. Today, the Castoroides continue through two living species, the North American beaver and the Eurasian beaver. Although much smaller than their giant relative, both retain the broad body form, aquatic adaptations, powerful incisors, and remarkable capacity to shape freshwater environments. Their continued survival provides a living connection to an evolutionary history extending far deeper than recorded human civilization. The North American beaver has become one of the continent's most important wildlife restoration species. Conservation projects increasingly recognize that healthy rivers often depend upon the presence of animals capable of reshaping water flow through ordinary daily activity. Beaver dams, slow moving water, encourage groundwater recharge, expand wetland habitat, and create conditions supporting fish, amphibians, birds, insects, and aquatic plants. The restoration of one species frequently produces benefits extending across entire watersheds. Studies conducted in rivers throughout the American West have demonstrated that returning beavers can improve survival for steelhead by creating cooler pools, increasing available shelter, and maintaining stream flow during dry seasons. Beaver wetlands also raise local water tables, reducing moisture loss from surrounding soils. Landscapes retaining more water become less vulnerable to intense wildfire, while ponds and wetlands trap sediments and filter agricultural runoff before it reaches larger river systems. Across the Atlantic, similar patterns have emerged. In Britain, where beavers remained absent for roughly 400 years, carefully managed reintroduction efforts have produced measurable improvements in water quality and biological diversity within little more than a decade. Wetlands expanded, native plants returned, and many aquatic organisms increased in abundance as restored waterways regained greater structural complexity through the work of a familiar ecosystem engineer. Elsewhere in the world, another remarkable rodent offers a distant reminder of how large members of this order can become. The capybara, though belonging to a different family, occupies a broadly comparable role as a substantial semi-aquatic herbivore. Reaching weights of approximately 140 pounds, it stands as the largest living rodent on Earth. Even so, it remains only a partial reflection of the scale once achieved by Castoroides during the Ice Age. Wetlands across the world continue carrying the influence of large rodents. Through grazing, movement, engineering, and the continual reshaping of freshwater habitats, these animals create opportunities for countless other forms of life. Their activities ripple outward through food webs, water chemistry, vegetation, and the physical structure of rivers and marshes. The Castoroides were never defined solely by the familiar beavers living today. Across millions of years, they included both engineers and grazers, shaping landscapes in different ways while helping construct freshwater ecosystems whose legacy still surrounds us. Even when the oldest chapters have largely slipped from memory, the journey eventually returns to something remarkably small. After tracing millions of years of evolution, changing climates, shifting ecosystems, and vanished populations, the story comes to rest in a single fossil resting beneath layers of peat. It is not an illustration or a reconstruction. It is the animal itself, preserved through an unlikely partnership between time, water, and earth. Across the Great Lakes region, countless peat deposits remain undisturbed beneath forests, wetlands, farmland, and expanding communities. Somewhere within those dark layers, giant beaver skeletons still rest where their owners finally settled thousands of years ago. Cold, waterlogged ground contains very little oxygen, slowing the activity of organisms that normally break down organic remains. Under such conditions, decay progresses with unusual reluctance, allowing traces of ancient life to endure across spans of time that seem almost beyond imagination. Peat ranks among the most forgiving natural archives on Earth. Bones may remain intact for thousands of years, while wood retains its structure with remarkable fidelity. Under especially favorable circumstances, even delicate soft tissues can persist long after they would have disappeared elsewhere. Each layer accumulates gradually, recording changing landscapes season after season until entire chapters of natural history become enclosed within a dense blanket of preserved vegetation and sediment. Nearly every Castoroides specimen known to science entered human awareness through chance rather than deliberate search. A farmer draining low ground uncovered unfamiliar bones. Construction workers excavating foundations encountered dark stained skeletons. Riverbanks slowly wore away beneath flowing water, exposing fossils that had remained concealed since the closing days of the Ice Age. Accidental discoveries have repeatedly opened windows into a world hidden only a short distance beneath familiar ground. When recovered, the bones possess an appearance unlike fresh skeletons. Years immersed within peat transform their color into deep shades resembling strongly brewed tea. Tannic acid dissolved within bog water gradually stains the surface, giving each fossil a richness that reflects its long burial. The bones also feel unexpectedly substantial, carrying the density acquired through thousands of years protected within saturated earth. Among all the recovered remains, the incisors are immediately recognizable. Their thick enamel survives more readily than most skeletal elements because it belongs among the hardest biological materials produced by mammals. Long after more delicate bones have fractured or disappeared, those remarkable teeth often remain ready to announce the presence of the giant beaver. Their distinctive form has guided many important discoveries. Holding one of these incisors offers an unusual connection across time. It curves in a broad crescent, fitting naturally into the hand while feeling heavier than its appearance suggests. Fine ridges run along its surface, giving the enamel a texture reminiscent of corrugated iron. Every contour reflects a lifetime spent cropping aquatic vegetation within freshwater wetlands that no longer resemble the places where those teeth are now recovered. Each fossil was shaped for an environment that has disappeared. It belonged to a diet whose details remained uncertain until scientific evidence clarified them during 2019. It supported a way of life that researchers continue assembling from anatomy, chemistry, geology, and careful comparison with living species. The work remains incomplete because every newly discovered specimen has the potential to refine what is presently understood. Geologically, the giant beaver vanished only moments ago. Human imagination, however, often experiences that lost world as though it belonged to another planet entirely. A single tooth lifted from dark peat bridges that extraordinary distance, offering the final physical connection between our familiar continent and an ice age landscape whose inhabitants still wait beneath the earth, preserved with remarkable patience until chance brings them once more into the light. The closing chapter of the giant beaver story is also the opening chapter of our own. Every forest, prairie, river, and wetland familiar today belongs to a continent assembled after one of the greatest ecological transitions of the recent geological past. We often imagine the Pleistocene as unimaginably distant, yet its conclusion occurred only about 11,700 years ago. By that time, Homo sapiens had already existed in fully modern form for at least 200,000 years, carrying language, imagination, and memory across landscapes that looked profoundly different from those we know today. The Ice Age did not fade because its allotted span had ended. Earth's orbit gradually shifted, altering the distribution of sunlight reaching the planet through the changing seasons. Those subtle astronomical rhythms influenced expanding and retreating ice sheets for roughly 2,600,000 years. As warming progressed, powerful climatic feedbacks that had maintained repeated glacial cycles gradually weakened, allowing a different environmental balance to emerge across much of the northern hemisphere. From that transformation, another continent slowly assembled itself. Retreating glaciers uncovered fresh landscapes. Rivers established new courses. Forests spread into territories once dominated by open tundra and steppe. Wetlands appeared in some places while disappearing from others. Every surviving species adjusted within an ecological community that no longer resembled the one inherited by its ancestors. The familiar world surrounding us today grew from those countless adjustments made across generations of plants and animals, adapting to altered conditions. The creatures that endured were rarely the largest or the most imposing. Many survived because they accepted change with greater flexibility. They broadened their diets when familiar foods declined. They occupied new habitats when previous ranges shifted. They reproduced quickly enough to recover from losses or traveled widely enough to follow favorable conditions. Their success reflected adaptability expressed through ordinary biological choices repeated over many generations. Castoroides deserves no place among evolutionary failures. Nothing in its history suggests an inferior animal or an unsuccessful design. For nearly 2 million years, it flourished within freshwater ecosystems that rewarded its remarkable specialization. Its anatomy, behavior, and ecological role proved exceptionally effective throughout an immense stretch of geological time. The challenge it eventually encountered lay outside the conditions that had shaped its evolution for countless generations. Every living species carries a similar inheritance. Each exists because its ancestors passed through environmental filters that eliminated countless alternative lineages. Survival rarely announces itself while it is happening. Organisms continue feeding, reproducing, migrating, and raising offspring without recognizing that the world surrounding them has begun changing in ways that will determine which descendants remain thousands of years later. Those living today represent the branches that continued growing after earlier pathways came to an end. Somewhere near the close of the Pleistocene, one giant beaver entered a familiar marsh for the last time. Its daily routine differed little from those of generations before it, though the landscape had already begun changing beyond the limits its specialized way of life could accommodate. That individual never returned, and eventually no others remained to follow the same trails through the water. Today, that former marsh may support rows of corn, streets lined with homes, or parking lots serving busy neighborhoods. Beneath those familiar places rests a deeper landscape carrying the memory of rivers, wetlands, and remarkable animals that shaped the continent before disappearing from living memory. The Pleistocene has never truly departed. It remains just below the surface of the present, continuing to influence every river valley, every wetland, and every surviving creature that inherited the world left in its wake.